Starts right now.
What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic?
Why can't women become priests?
1-833-288-EWTN.
I don't understand why I have to earn salvation.
1-833-288-3986.
What's stopping?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Well, the bad news is it's year 2 of the pandemic. The good news is we made it to Friday. It's Called to Communion here on EWTN, the Global Catholic Network. This program is specifically for non-Catholics. If that's you, if you've stepped away from the Catholic faith for whatever reason and now you're looking at it again and you've got some questions that need to be answered, well, that's why we're here. Also for people who have never been a Catholic and you've got questions about the Catholic faith. In any event, what is stopping you from becoming a Catholic? Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Now, if you're listening to us outside of North America, please dial the U.S. country code and then 205-271-2985. You can also text the letters EWTN to 55000. Wait for our response and then text us your first name and your brief question. Message and data rates may apply. And you can always send us an email. ctc@ewtn.com is the address for that. Charles Beery is our producer, and we also have Ryan Penny handling the phones. Jeff Burson is on social media, so if you want to ask a question via YouTube or Facebook Live, you can do that by putting that question of yours in the comments section. Jeff will shoot that to us here in Studio 1. I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
Very well. How are you, sir?
Oh, doing decent. Thank you.
Weekend plans, what do you think?
I enjoy this nice weather we're having in Alabama.
It is just gorgeous. I think it's in the 70s right now, isn't it?
Yep.
Pretty awesome. I just was corresponding with a mutual friend of ours in Denver who's looking at like Snowmageddon this weekend. So I guess we'll make it. So I want to lead off here with an email from Lisa, and I think you'll get a kick out of this. This is one of those great emails for a Friday. Lisa says, I'm a practicing Catholic, but for years have had a number of questions about my faith. Here are 2 of them. Why would Jesus blast that fig tree? It was obviously not in season or in the shade or whatever reason it didn't produce figs. Jesus didn't give it a chance. He just blasted it. Also in Mark 4, verses 1 through 20, Jesus says he speaks in parables so that people would not understand and therefore would not be converted and forgiven. Why is that? These 2 things seem so uncharacteristic of Jesus. Thanks, Lisa.
Okay, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So on the first one, on blasting the fig tree, I think blasting the fig tree is just a kind of a performative lesson. It's just a metaphor for this is what happens to people who don't bear fruit in their life. And so we're meant to draw a spiritual conclusion from it. It's not that Jesus is like prejudiced against fig trees or something. When it comes to the Mark chapter 4, this goes actually deeply into the character of Christ. And you made the statement, this doesn't seem characteristic of him. I think it's very characteristic of Jesus as he's presented to us in the Gospels, because Christ does not come simply to be a teacher of universal moral truth. Right, and that's a common misunderstanding of Christ, that, Jesus is a great religious leader who gives universal moral truths, and, we can approach him the way we do any other religious leader and maybe try to put those principles into practice. That's really not the way to respond to Christ, and it's not what Jesus was about. Christ began his public ministry with the proclamation that the kingdom of God is here. And in doing so, he was really speaking to longstanding Hebrew expectation of a coming period of time when God would reign among the nations, and there would be peace among men, and the God of Israel would be acknowledged throughout the world, and the lion would lie down with the lamb, and people would beat their swords into plowshares. This is the expectation. It doesn't refer to some sort of interior religious experience, but really to the fulfillment of this prophetic expectation about the ultimate destiny of the people of Israel. And Christ says, that's here, this has come, this is now in your midst, not within you, that's a bad translation, but in your midst. And he himself was the demonstration of the arrival of the kingdom. He said to the Pharisees, if I cast out demons by the Spirit of God, by the finger of God, then you know the kingdom of God has come among you. He was the manifestation, the presence of the kingdom. But to accept that message required a kind of radical revisioning of oneself in relationship to Israel and the people of God in the future. When the Pharisees asked him, well, why does the prophet say that Elijah must come first? He says, well, if you're willing to accept it, I'm going to give you a new frame of reference. John the Baptist is that Elijah who was to come. He's really challenging people to rethink what it meant to be the people of God, not just at the level of sort of abstract moral truth, but hey, we're radically rethinking, reliving what it means to be in relationship to the God of Israel. And so the parables are not just moral lessons. They are the means whereby the kingdom is made manifest, and it would require coming and following Christ, entering into relationship with him, not just accepting abstract truths that he would teach, but embracing him as the manifestation of the kingdom. Think about Christ's dialogue with the rich ruler in Mark chapter 10. He says, I've kept all the commandments. And Christ says, one thing you lack, sell what you have, give to the poor, come and follow me. The parables were an invitation to shed an older way of conceiving of oneself in relationship to Israel and the people of God and enter into a relationship with Christ, discipleship that requires this radical reconfiguration and joining a new community, the new people of God constituted by faith in Jesus. That's not something that can simply be communicated as an abstract truth. It's a reality in which one has to participate. That's why it was only to the disciples that Christ really unfolded his full purpose and his full identity. He invited people into relationship with himself and then began to really unpack what it meant to be a disciple.
All right. Thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you so much for your email. And if you'd like to send us an email for a future show, the address is ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. We try to get to a couple of emails on each of our live shows, and then about once a month or so, we'll pick things up with a mailbag edition of our program. Those are always fun, aren't they, David?
Oh, yeah, I enjoy those.
I really do, too, because sometimes we can stretch out and read some of those longer emails that we just can't get to during the live show. Anyway, the address again, ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. Well, we are certainly live right now, and we would love to hear from you. Our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. Remember, phones fill up very quickly on Fridays, so if you don't want to hold that question over till next week, call now, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. The Friday afternoon edition of Call to Communion on EWTN. Stay with us.
EWTN News In Depth is important for Catholics everywhere. There are so many questions, there are so many unknowns out there as the world continues to change at a rapid pace. We're going to ask the tough questions and get the right answers and make sure that when you watch this show, you feel engaged and you feel empowered.
EWTN News In Depth. Engaged, informed, Catholic. Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio and Television.
We pray because we want to come into union with God. He wants to breathe His life into us, and we want to accept that life, because in accepting that life, we begin to experience the abundance that He has in mind for us to receive. Pray to God. Lift your praises high to God and present to Him every supplication that you might find the grace you need for the present moment that He presents to you. Everything good comes from prayer, says Mother Teresa of Calcutta, and so it is true.
The wisdom of Mother Angelica.
Have you ever been so grief-stricken and so heart-sick that you can't see God? You can't see God in the tragedy. You can't see God in that cross. You can't see God in that sin. Why? You're enveloped in that grief. You're enveloped in fear. And God is out the window. You don't see Him standing right next to you.
EWTN. Live truth. Live.
It's Call to Communion here on EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, we would love to hear from you on this Friday afternoon, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Hey, I want to congratulate another long-time EWTN partner. It's Billings Catholic Radio in Montana. They are celebrating their 10th anniversary this month. Want to give a special shout out to Roy Brown, his great team at Billings Catholic Radio. They started out with one station in Billings. They are now evangelizing and educating and inspiring their listeners on 3 signals in Billings and Laurel. So again, our congratulations to Billings Catholic Radio, now celebrating 10 years of solid Catholic radio in Montana. One more quick reminder here before we go to the phones, and that number, by the way, 833-288-EWTN. If you haven't checked out Church Pop, we recommend that. Church Pop takes a fresh and fun look at the news shaping our world. It features engaging, inspiring, and informative Catholic social media content. A lot of fun on Church Pop. You can find it on Snapchat, on Instagram, and on the web at churchpop.com. And if you want that to hit your email inbox, you can do that by visiting EWTN.com. Click on subscribe, the subscribe box there, and that'll open up a little menu for you. Just click on Church Pop, and you are good to go. All right, if you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN. We begin on this Friday afternoon with Mike in Madisonville, Louisiana, listening on Catholic Community Radio. Hey, Mike, happy Friday to you. What's on your mind today?
And happy Friday to you. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
Do you have an idea how long Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden before they ate the forbidden fruit? I mean, I don't know if it was a day, a week, 10 years, 100 years. Do we have a time frame on that?
Yeah, thank you. There's no answer to that question. There's no answer to that question. And the text of Scripture, in telling us the story of Adam and Eve, doesn't really present it as a kind of historical chronicle, right? But as a highly figurative account of man's relationship to God and the nature of our condition. And that's really the lesson we're supposed to draw from it, is about our own spiritual condition of alienation and our need for redemption. It really doesn't get into the sort of detailed history of, early anthropology.
Is that helpful for you?
I figured that was your answer. I didn't know if they were holding out or if they went bad immediately. So, yeah, I guess.
Yeah, I don't think there's an answer to the question.
Okay. There you go, Mike. Appreciate your call. That opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. 3 lines open at the moment. They won't stay that way for long. 833-288-3986. What's keeping you from becoming a Catholic? What's stopping you? What is keeping you there at the 1-yard line? Why haven't you stepped over the goal yet? Call us 833-288-EWTN. Here now is Sean in Port Perry, Ontario, listening on his Alexa device. Sean, what's on your mind today?
Hello, Tom. Good afternoon, Dr. Anders. Several weeks ago, somebody was asking about the sources of tradition, because one knows that the Catholic Church teaches that its doctrines, its beliefs are based on both Scripture and tradition. And you were mentioning a book that sort of summarizes the teachings of the early Church Fathers. You said you could read an entire book by one of the Fathers and maybe the part that dealt with a specific doctrine was only one chapter or whatever, and that this would be summarized in this book that you referred to. And unfortunately, I didn't make a note of the title of the book, and I'll bet there are other people out there who also didn't or would like to know it. So can I ask again what that was?
Sure. I remember the call. So a little bit of a confusion about what I was claiming. I had a call one time recently about, is there a single source where I can find all the dogmas of the Church, right? Because the Church teaches certain things authoritatively and says you have to believe this. And is there a sort of repository of all the things that the Church has dogmatically defined? And that's not the same thing as the teaching of the Church Fathers. And so that book to which I was referring, that sort of list of authoritative Catholic teaching, is Denzinger's Enchiridion, and it's not an easy read. It's a digest of quotations from councils and popes, and it's not, it's not good bedside reading. It's really a scholarly book, honestly. Now, there are books that do kind of summarize the teaching of the early fathers on various topics. One of my favorite is a book by J.N.D. Kelly called Early Christian Doctrine, and it's a compilation of sayings and passages from the Church Fathers composed according to theme or topic. Yaroslav Pelikan's book, The Catholic Tradition, takes a similar line. I appreciate that a lot. If somebody wants an introduction simply to the Fathers themselves, Michael Aquilina is a guy who has done a lot of publishing in the area, just sort of giving us compilations of texts from the Church Fathers. In terms of sort of secondary sources, pithy introductions to the Fathers and their thought, I don't think you can do better than the catechetical lectures of Pope Benedict XVI and his Wednesday audience. He began with the apostles and lectured his way through the major figures of Catholic history up, through the Middle Ages. And so, he has a collection, for example, of his speeches published called The Church Fathers from Clement of Rome to Augustine, and on and on. So, about a page or two on each of the major Church Fathers from Pope Benedict. That's a great source. Anybody who's interested in the Church Fathers, in my judgment, can do no better than to start by reading them directly. And the one you need to start with is Augustine of Hippo, and you need to read the Confessions of St. Augustine. It's not only a seminal text in patristic theology, but it's also one of the great works of Western literature, and arguably the first intellectual autobiography in Western history.
And not a hard read either.
The Confessions?
Yeah.
Well, yeah and no.
Well,
right? I mean, it can. I've read the Confessions any number of times, and you can read it at the level of a biography, of a narrative, and you can get the main points, and that's interesting. But it's also philosophically and theologically very rich, and so scholars will go back to the Confessions again and again and again for decades of their life and never plumb its depths.
There you go, Sean. Appreciate your call. Call to communion here on EWTN. Our phone number 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Now, you mentioned the Enchiridion. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah, Denzinger's Enchiridion.
Now, why do you suppose that nobody has put together a popular book like a dogma dictionary or a dogma for dummies or something like that everybody could pick up and say, okay, here are the 357 things that I have to believe?
Well, the closest there would be Ludwig Ott's book Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma. It's a little bit out of date. I mean, it's 1950s, so it hadn't been updated in half a century, but Ludwig Ott's very readable, very accessible. But look, people get hung up on the question of where's a list of all the dogmas? Give me a list of all the dogmas. All right? That's one way of approaching the question. The other way of approaching the question is simply to ask, what do I need to believe if I'm Catholic? And there's no end of specification. You can highly qualify your belief down to a pinprick. But if you want to know the main outlines of the Catholic faith, what is the mind of the Church, and so that you really have a good understanding, well, we don't need all these esoteric books. We need the Catechism of the Catholic Church.
Okay.
So if somebody just wants, what does the Catholic Church believe? And you're not going to get every single thing that's ever been defined in the Catholic Church, but you're going to get the major outline. Get the Catechism of the Catholic Church.
Sounds good. Call to communion here on EWTN. Let's go to Marlene in the beautiful city of Bismarck, North Dakota, listening on YouTube. A first-time caller. Hi there, Marlene. What's on your mind today?
Hi. Good afternoon. Thank you for taking my call.
Sure.
I have a question. I've been a practicing Catholic all my life, and I often wonder what happens with our souls after we die, or for the people remaining if you lose a loved one. Are we to believe that they are rejoicing in heaven, or are they simply asleep until the second coming of Christ?
Yeah.
And then also what people that talk to mediums like on TV and they're talking to their loved ones, is that real?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate these questions. So the teaching of the Church is that at physical death, one of three things is going to happen to you. You either go directly to heaven and experience the vision of God. It's called the beatific vision. Or you go to purgatory, where you do penance and are purified of your attachment to sin, and then are admitted to the beatific vision at some future point. Or you go to hell. Those are your three options. Glory, purgatory, or hell. And hell is a one-way ticket. There's no getting out of hell. All right. Purgatory is just a temporary stopover Nobody's going to end eternity in purgatory. Purgatory will eventually be emptied out into heaven. So those are your options. And nobody's asleep. All right, so we are conscious in the next life. And that's the Catholic teaching. Now, with respect to people who claim to communicate with the dead through mediums and spiritists, this is strictly forbidden by sacred scripture and by church teaching. It is a profoundly dangerous and superstitious activity, and we should discourage it with everything we can discourage it with. It's a very bad idea. People who claim to be mediums generally are doing one of two things. Either they are charlatans who are duping the credulous and taking their money because people have this craving to talk to their loved ones and they're being taken advantage of. And I think that's probably the vast majority of cases. Or they're communicating with demonic spirits that are impersonating dead loved ones. But this is not something that Christ teaches us to do. It's something that the Church strictly forbids. And anytime we do something that smacks of magic, the difference between magic and true religion, Christ and the Virgin Mary model true religion to us, and it is the attitude that says, "Be it done to me according to thy word, not my will, but thine be done." That's really the disposition that we have as Christian believers. We love God, and we trust God, and we trust His providence even when we don't understand it. And so we seek to be reconciled to the will of God in spite of our circumstances, even though we may not know why bad things are happening to us, including the death of a loved one. Now, the magician takes another point of view. He says, "May the world move according to my will. May my will be done." Yeah. And I'm going to try to manipulate invisible forces and spirits or powers or whatnot to do my will, force the dead to come talk to me or to serve my interests or purposes. It's really the opposite disposition, the opposite attitude of true religion, and it's very dangerous, and the Church forbids it.
Appreciate your call, Marlene. Hope that's helpful for you. Call to communion here on EWTN. Couple of lines open at the moment, 833-288-EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, 833-288-3986. Here is Rose now in Grand Island, Nebraska, listening on Spirit Catholic Radio. Hi, Rose. What's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom, and thank you, Dr. Anders, for your ministry. I'm so grateful for it. I had a question with regard to your answer about the Church Fathers, that the Confessions of St. Augustine would be a good book to start with. And I've got 3 granddaughters that are going to be receiving a confirmation this year, and then 1 son-in-law that's going to be joining the church. Would that be a good book to give them? And then also, is there a publisher that publishes an English, the new modern English of it? So it's easier to read.
Thank you. Appreciate the question. So I would not give the confessions to someone who is soon to be confirmed, if, a young person who's going to be confirmed, unless this young person were a serious reader with a keen intellect. Augustine's Confessions are fantastic, magnificent books. It is a deeply intellectual text, and so it would not be very accessible to, say, a 13, 14-year-old person, unless they were a very, very serious reader with a keen mind. And even then, someone that age is not going to get half the book. It's going to be over their head. An 18-year-old, 19-year-old, 20-year-old, that's a different story. But okay. 13, 14, probably too much for them. Any translation is better than no translation. I like a couple different translations from Penguin publishers that I particularly like. Any one of those is fine. There's a new translation out, very contemporary, by Thomas Williams. It's also very good.
Okay. Appreciate that. Rose, thank you so much for your call. Quick email here from Abby. I am new at attending Catholic Mass. I found this odd. Perhaps you can explain it to me. It really bothered me to the point that I'm reaching out to you today. Just before the priest took communion, he took half of the host and put it in his right pocket. Can you elaborate? Is that the proper way to handle the Eucharist?
Don't know anything about any right pockets. That's not part of the rubrics.
Yeah, that's a new one on me.
Don't know about that one. Now, it's not uncommon for a priest to have an open pyx. A pyx is a little gold circular box, and to carry the Blessed Sacrament, to reserve the Blessed Sacrament to take to the sick. And sometimes people will give the priest a pyx before Mass and say, could you reserve the Blessed Sacrament? Because I'm an extraordinary minister of communion and I've got a sick person and I got to take the host to the sick person after Mass. Maybe the priest himself had an appointment, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon to go visit the sick, and he was going to bring communion to someone, and he had his own pyx.
Oh, yeah.
Perhaps he placed the Blessed Sacrament in the pyx and then placed the pyx in his pocket to keep for giving communion later. But to place a naked host without a pyx in his pocket would be highly irregular.
It would. But like you say, perhaps it was in his pocket, the little pyx, and although my mom always told me to stay away from pyx pockets.
Oh, yeah.
I just couldn't resist that. All right, call to communion here on EWTN. He just shakes his head. That's, what else are you going to do? All right, phone.
Tom, sometimes you knock him out of the park.
And then there are those other times.
Right.
Okay. Thank you for that vote of confidence. In a moment, we're going to talk with Ken in Plymouth, Michigan, listening on Ave Maria Radio. But there's a line open for you right now. Do grab it at 833-288-EWTN. What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic? Call now, 833-288-3986 for Call to Communion.
Valentine
Ernia, Marktile ang Kaskas.
Satyani Jaga, Katolik Raha.
In any language, it means the same. Live truth. Live Catholic. EWTN.
He was a pope, a saint, and a doctor of the Church.
Matthew Bunson and the Doctors of the Church.
Pope St. Gregory I the Great is one of only 4 popes honored as the Great. Among his many achievements was sending missionaries across Northern Europe, especially St. Augustine of Canterbury, who brought Christ to the people of England. In a pun, Pope Gregory called the English people angels. He died in 604.
For more about the Doctors of the Church, visit doctorsofthechurch.com.
This is a Messy Family Minute with Mike and Alicia Hernan. In the document Lumen Gentium, the Church tells us the family is, so to speak, the domestic church. In it, parents should, by their word and example, be the first preachers of the faith to their children. This worldwide pandemic has made it even more clear that the spiritual responsibility for children rests firmly in the hands of parents.
Parents need to create an environment of prayer at home and then teach their children the tools of prayer. If prayer time, with little ones especially, becomes a wrestling match or playtime, we suggest that you remove items of amusement, ignore distracting behavior from young children, and then be an example to them by turning your own mind and heart to God. If parents and older children have a heartfelt attitude of prayer, they set the right tone and example for the little ones. Remember, our Heavenly Father loves our best efforts to honor Him and will take our messy offerings and return them with grace and favor.
For more ideas on prayer, visit us at messyfamilyminute.org.
Monday on More to Life, Lentil Health.
Join us as we continue to fast from falsehood and overcome the lies that hold us back.
That's Monday on More to Life. Now, back to Call to Communion.
What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic? Let's talk about it on Call to Communion here on EWTN. We have one line open at the moment, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Before we go back to the phones, a quick question here from Cyrus watching on YouTube today. Cyrus says, Christ gives authority to St. Peter. So why is it that when we read the New Testament and in the book of Acts, the Apostle James is in charge? This is when Paul visits Jerusalem.
Yeah, thanks. So I don't think that James is in charge. I do think it's helpful to go back and look at what was going on in the early church at the time. We know from the epistles of Paul that there were parties, there were factions in first century Christianity, and there was a group associated with James that hung out in Jerusalem, and a company of people who were related to Christ's cousins. You know, he had cousins, and so there were extended family members, and as is often the case, you know, these folks thought they were the stuff. You know,
Yeah.
they were Jesus's relatives. You know, and they were also hardliners in terms of obedience to the Mosaic law, and so they were kind of pushy in the early Christian world about this is the way you need to do business. You know, Gentiles have to be circumcised if they want to come and follow Christ, and They were a real faction, a real party in the church, and they were causing havoc. And so St. Paul had to write against them in a number of places. Peter himself seems to have grown in his own understanding of the nature of Gentile inclusion. I mean, he was a faithful Jew, and he didn't eat with Gentiles, and he didn't fellowship with them. And God had to send him a vision of the beasts in the blanket being let down, and the voice that said, "Go kill and eat." And he's like, "No way, God, I've never done any of that sort of thing. No, what I've declared clean, you can go partake of." And then he gets the visit from Cornelius. So, Peter's out evangelizing, doing the work of an apostle, but his own understanding of Christ is developing, and he has to have some extraordinary revelations to help him understand that it's really okay to go to the Gentiles. So he does. He goes off. He's a missionary. He goes to Cornelius. Cornelius receives the faith, is baptized by Peter. And then Peter goes back to Jerusalem. And keep in mind, there are hardliners there, and James is key among them, that are kind of towing the line and what they think is the right thing to do. And Peter goes back and testifies, "Let me tell you what the Lord has shown me. This is the way we're going to go. This is the way we're going to go." And what did James and the party at Jerusalem do? They say, "Sir, yes, sir." And they get on board, and the Council of Jerusalem concedes Peter's opinion. Now, it would be false to think of Peter's primacy in the first century, with all of the regalia and the decor that would later evolve around the papacy, right? So if you imagine Peter's papacy as being exactly analogous to the way Pope Francis operates today, Peter's not riding around in the Pope mobile, and sending out encyclicals and this sort of thing. I mean, there are historic developments in the doctrine of the papacy, the nature of the papacy. But that Christ constituted him the head of the church, and that his voice was final on this, how that would play out sort of procedurally is something that develops over time. But the fact of his testimony being authoritative is evident in sacred Scripture, and it seems reasonable that the reason Matthew gives such prominence to Peter in Matthew 16 is precisely because of this issue with James, that he wants to show, like, the Petrine answer to this question about Gentiles is the authoritative one. Look what Christ gave to Peter. And that's why we see in Matthew's gospel this story is given such focus, right? Because this is a particularly neuralgic issue, this Gentile issue. And then you go about a century later, or into the second century, and we see the bishops of Rome with that clear sense of their Petrine succession and their primacy. I love this passage in Tertullian on modesty, I think it is, when he's debating with the Pope about not the Gentile inclusion, but the inclusion of manifest sinners, right? Whether they can be reconciled to the church through penance. Tertullian does not want them in. He's kind of like James and the guys in Jerusalem. He's a hardliner. And he knows the Pope Calixtus, wants to bring these guys in to reconcile them. And Tertullian says, "And I know what you're going to say, Mr. Pope. You're going to say that you sit on the seat of Peter, and what you bind on earth is bound in heaven, therefore you can do this." Right? He understood, Tertullian himself understood that was the papal claim. Now, he didn't like that, so he left the church. But that was the way the popes understood their authority, just like St. Peter.
Very good. Cyrus, thank you for your question. By the way, as a quick follow-up here, George is listening on Facebook. He says, "I'm listening to your answer right now. What if all the other apostles at the Council of Jerusalem rejected Peter's opinion? Would his authority still be valid?"
Yeah, thanks. So, in the Chronicles of Narnia, Aslan was fond of saying, "No one has ever told what would have happened." Right? I mean, we have the history that we have.
Right.
We don't have the history that we didn't have.
Okay.
So it's an impossible question to answer.
All right. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Here is Ken in Plymouth, Michigan, listening on the great Ave Maria radio. Ken, what's on your mind today?
But Peter's opinion would still be authoritative.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I want to say.
Okay. Ken, what's up?
Hi, you're my favorite on the whole station. You're wonderful. Thank you very much for being on the air.
Thank you.
My question is, my wife passed away here December 15th from cancer.
So sorry.
Colon cancer. So everybody should get a colon checkup. But I was curious as to how long I should mourn my darling wife, Anne Regis Sands, for my purpose is a question mark. I don't know. I've talked to other people about it, but how long should I mourn my wife?
Yeah, thank you. So, in terms of the teaching of the Catholic Church, there is not some sort of mandated period of mourning that you have to follow. I really think it comes down to your own psychology in the process of grief. And what little I know about grief counseling, having experienced some myself, is that no two people grieve in exactly the same way. And my one suggestion to you would be to consider the possibility that maybe grief is a variable thing, and there may be a time in the future, in the next few months, that you begin to feel things more intensely than now or less intensely than now, and where you are right now in your grief may not be descriptive of where you'll be 6 months from now. And there's really no getting over grief. There's learning to live with it and to integrate it into your life and personality. So, you take the time that you need to mourn her and to come to terms with it and live with this horrible loss that you've experienced. And our hearts go out to you, and we're very sorry.
Ken, thank you so much for your call. We'll be praying for you and for the soul of your wife as well. Let's go to Rob in Seattle right now, listening on Sacred Heart Radio. Rob, what's on your mind today?
Hello. So my question is around natural evils or natural disasters. We see things on the earth like earthquakes, tsunamis, and they end up taking a lot of lives and causing suffering for many, many people. I'm just curious, why would God design a world where these things occur, where we have these types of disasters?
Thanks. Appreciate the question. So all evil is, to a certain extent, a kind of mystery. And, of course, what we call natural evil, things like earthquakes and landslides, they're not really evil. They're only evil when they happen to us. Like, no one is offended when a rock falls off a mountainside. We only hurt by it when they happen to land on us.
Well,
so the real question is, why do we get to be standing under the rock when it comes down?
Mm-hmm.
Why in God's providence doesn't He protect us from those kinds of things? And the short answer is that God permits suffering into human lives because He has a greater purpose that He wants to accomplish. And this is no comfort to somebody who's in the throes of suffering. Well, it might be of some comfort, but oftentimes it isn't. And you meet somebody who's suffering, approaching them and saying, well, God's letting this happen for a reason, may not help them very much,
no.
Especially if they think you're insincere. I'm really sorry, and I'm here to accompany you and be your friend. That may be of more value. But oftentimes after the fact, when we look back on our own experience of suffering, sometimes great suffering, we can see how we've grown as a person. We've developed more empathy or wisdom, more compassion, more trust and faith in God. And we can see, yes, something good came out of this that I wouldn't have anticipated. One of my favorite examples, very good friend of mine, very dear friend of mine, Bob Lujano. I'm always mentioning him on the show. When he was 7, 8 years old, he lost all of his limbs, became a quadruple amputee. And, of course, it was just a horrific thing to have happen to him. And, needless to say, his dream of being a professional baseball player was taken away from him. And he lost a lot of other things as well. Lost a parent, lost incredible opportunities and great suffering, nearly died 2 or 3 times. And but today, if you talk to Bob and he looks back over the course of his life, he'll tell you that this accident was the greatest thing that ever happened to him because God had brought good things into his life as a result of his suffering that he never would have experienced otherwise. And he's closer to God and his wife and his friends than he otherwise would have been. And so he's grateful for what happened to him. Now, I wouldn't tell him that.
Right.
But this is what he says about himself.
Sure.
And we don't always see that. We don't always have the perspective that says, yeah, something good has happened to me because of this. Maybe we don't know. Maybe we won't know until the next life.
Mm-hmm.
But that's what trust in God is about, that even in spite of the appearances, we trust that God in His goodness has a plan and that these things happen to us for a reason.
Call to Communion here on EWTN. Rob, thank you so much for your call. David, you were talking about suffering, and I think everybody to one extent or another, has been suffering through this pandemic period. So that makes a program like our very own Dr. Doctor a very important part of your Saturday morning weekend listening. We recommend it strongly. It's at 11 a.m. Eastern. This week, infectious disease specialist Dr. Paul Carson and vaccinologist Dr. John Grabenstein. They're going to be back with the latest on the COVID-19 pandemic, including some very good news about lower infections and deaths and effective vaccines. Check it out tomorrow morning, 11 a.m. Eastern, right here on EWTN Radio. Back to the phones now for Call to Communion. Matt is listening in Chesapeake, Virginia on YouTube. Hey there, Matt. What's on your mind today?
Hey, what's up, fellas? My question is, what parts of church teaching can change and what parts of church teaching cannot change? I'll hang up now.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. So, truth doesn't change. I mean, 2 + 2 is never going to stop equaling 4, right? And, it's never going to not be the case that Christ rose from the dead or that he was born of the Blessed Virgin Mary, right? I mean, truth is truth, and we can't make it to be untrue.
Mm-hmm.
Now, but the church does grow and develop in her understanding and relevance of truth, and the way that she expresses truth can be given greater and greater specificity. And a great example of this would be the development of Trinitarian and Christological dogma in the first 4 centuries. So the early church had a strong implicit belief in the divinity of Christ and worshiped Christ, prayed to Christ as to God, and understood that by being in union with Christ, they were coming into relationship with God himself. But yet the church lacked a kind of scientific definition of Christ's divinity. And in the early 4th century, there was a heretic by the name of Arius that said, well, I'm going to get specific about what this means for Christ to be divine. And he said, well, what it means is Christ is divine with a lowercase d, God with a small g. And he's not really God. He's just sort of like God. He's a creature, but who has, sort of divine-like attributes. And that seems to solve the problem. That's what Arius thought. This solves the problem. Now I can maintain the unity of God and the divinity of Christ without any kind of confusion, and problem solved.
Yeah.
And the church said, sorry, Arius, that's not what we mean. We mean God with a capital G, full stop.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Council of Nicaea was called to specify exactly what we mean by the divinity of Christ. God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, not a creature. And we have that definition of Christ's divinity. But that raises a different question. Okay, if that's who Jesus is, well, what about his humanity? What about his person? What's the nature of Christ's humanity? Is he 2 things? Is he a God and a man? Is he one thing? What is he, right? And so you have to get the Council of Chalcedon to define exactly the way the divine and the human in Christ are joined in his person, right? The hypostatic union. And so new questions call forth new levels of specificity in the church's proclamation. So in one sense, the deposit of faith grows by elaboration, but not by additional content, if you will. Now, there are other ways in which the church can sort of refine her formulation when she's confronted with new moral questions that she hadn't thought of before, and may wrestle with trying to discern the good in a particular situation,
Mm-hmm.
and may discern new principles that are implicit in the natural law. So, a big example of this would be, the discovery of the New World and people that had never been anticipated, folks that we never knew existed. The Europeans didn't know existed, the Americans. Well, what does that mean? All of our moral theology is oriented towards Christendom, towards, the treatment of Christians toward Christians within a civil community that has a sort of common religious framework and philosophical framework. How do we interact in this pluralistic world we've just discovered? And there were some folks that said, well, we know what to do. Let's kill them all and take the gold. And there were others that said, no, we don't think that's allowed. We don't think that's allowed. And so the church actually develops a doctrine of human rights. It was Catholic theologians that first propounded the theory of universal human rights, specifically to address the question of what about native peoples in lands that Europeans have colonized. Well, before the 16th century, there was no doctrine of universal human rights because the question hadn't been formulated, hadn't been raised in that way.
Yeah.
But then going back to traditional natural law thinking and the doctrine of justice and our common destiny and being made in God's image and likeness, the church is able to formulate a doctrine of human rights. And so, there's development and greater specification and elaboration, but not contradiction of previous dogmatic teaching.
Call to communion here on EWTN. Let's go to Jeremiah now in Knightstown, Indiana. Hey there, Jeremiah. What's on your mind today?
Hello. I'm a fan of your show.
Thank you.
I'm not Catholic, but it's something that I've always was interested in. And but I wanted to have your what you think about angels. Like as far as angels coming down to be somebody else to help you in certain situations, whether it's health or crisis of some kind. What do you say?
Thank you. I appreciate the question. So an angel is a spirit and does not have a body, and therefore is not spatially located in the way that bodies are spatially located. It doesn't have extension or mass or any of the properties of bodies. However, angels can interact with the material world through God's power in ways that affect us in our senses. And there's evidence in sacred scripture of God allowing angels to interact with people in this way so that they appear to them as people. And the 3 visitors to Abraham, for example, is a good instance of that. Now, they don't become biological humans because the human person is a different species from an angel. The angel does not change species. It does not cease to be an angel, but it can interact with a human in ways that affect the senses, the human senses, so that they would appear perhaps as human. Now, that's very unusual. That's very unusual. And I would not presume, if I interacted with a kind person on the side of the street who did me a good turn, my first thought is not going to be, well, that's obviously an angel. I'm not going to conclude that. Although, stranger things have happened.
Appreciate your call, Jeremiah. Let's go to Lou in Seattle, listening right there in Seattle. Hey, Lou, what's on your mind today?
Yes, I have a question concerning I live in an assisted living facility, and I am not able to go out to Mass. And I was wondering if I watch EWTN Mass and all the other programs a lot during the day, and I was wondering if the Sunday Mass takes care of the obligation for a Holy Mass.
Yes, thank you. So if you are unable to attend Mass, it is not possible for you to get to Mass, then you are not obligated to go to Mass. So you don't have a Sunday obligation.
Right.
If it's not possible for you, you can't be required to do what is impossible for you to do. And there are many people in your situation who, because of health or distance or some other factor, are not able to attend Sunday Mass. Well, they are excused of their obligation. And for many people, watching the televised Mass is a wonderful way to honor the Lord's Day. And
stay connected with the church.
To stay connected with the church. And I think that, Tom, correct me if I'm wrong, but the broadcast Mass on EWTN is the most popular program on EWTN.
It is. It is, and I'm glad of it, and I'm glad that it's something that Mother Angelica instituted many years ago, because when TV first went on the air, we didn't carry the Mass, but when we went from 4 hours a day on 4 hours a day on TV to 24 hours a day, that was one of the first things she wanted to do. She said, let's get the Mass on the air.
And, let me tell you something. I know the friars that say Mass at EWTN, and they work hard.
You bet.
Because they are conscious that they're preaching to the whole world, and they put a lot into those homilies, a lot more than like your average daily Mass. Because these guys understand that this is a real duty that they're of evangelization to the whole world, and they take it very seriously.
God bless you, Lou. Thank you so much for your call. Here is Ron in St. Louis listening on Covenant Radio. Ron, what's on your mind today?
Oh, pretty good here. Yeah, I'm actually calling from Alton, Illinois, which is north of St. Louis. But anyhow, we pick you guys up on 92.7 and 1460 AM.
Very good.
And yeah, I'm a good Catholic. I've been a good Catholic. I became Catholic about 2 years ago. Well, it'll be 2 years this Easter, and just got done eating a fish sandwich. So anyway. Yeah, I had a question about St. Valentine. Okay, growing up as a kid, I grew up Protestant, okay? You know, we had St. Valentine's and St. Valentine's Day, and all of a sudden, Saint's gone. And I would really like to know what happened to the saint on Valentine. You know, who got rid of it and why? Okay, you have the answer to that?
Yeah, sure. So the feast of Saint Valentine began in the 5th century. It was instituted by Pope Gelasius, and Valentine was a Roman martyr. We don't know much about Valentine other than that he was a Roman martyr, and so he paid the ultimate price for his fidelity to Christ. Now, all this sort of cultural accoutrements about associations with romantic love. A little bit speculative, but there's some suggestion that Gelasius may have instituted the feast to counteract a kind of bacchanalian Roman pagan feast where young people were running around doing a bunch of wild stuff, and he said, well, instead of doing a bunch of wild stuff, why don't we honor a saint? And they said okay, and they kept on doing wild stuff. You know, so that kind of got conflated with some previous traditions, and there's another line of reasoning that sees in the courtly love tradition of medieval Europe, the troubadour poetry. Somehow or another, this thing got tied in. But the saint himself, he was a martyr.
Okay, there you go, Ron. Thanks so much for your call. Hope you enjoyed that fish sandwich. Let's go to Austin in Lincoln, Nebraska, listening on Spirit Catholic Radio. Austin, what's on your mind today?
Hi, yeah. I have a friend that is a member of this other church. I'm just trying to figure out if it's a cult or something. I was just wondering if you've ever heard of Awesong Home. And, like, they have, like, a church here in town, and I've, like, just been kind of taking Bible studies with them, and it just seems a little...
Yeah, I would stay away. This is not any form of Orthodox Christianity, and they have some highly irregular beliefs. I would stay away from this group.
Okay, very good. And Peter is in Denver listening on Catholic Radio Network. Hey, Peter, what's on your mind today?
Yes. Hi, Tom. Hi, Dr. Andrews. My question is, did Jesus' resurrected body change in appearance? Because his disciples didn't recognize him when they walked with him.
Yes.
And he had to show them his wounds before
So it's important to emphasize that the resurrected body of Jesus is a body. It is a material body. I mean, he can eat. He makes a big show of the fact that he can eat. But it was also different from his pre-resurrection body. And you make a very important point that the disciples on the road to Emmaus did not recognize Christ. He can also pass through walls. And last time I checked, I didn't have that ability to pass through walls. Right?
Wouldn't that be cool, though, if you could? Oh, yeah.
And St. Paul, who tells us that our own resurrected bodies will be modeled after Christ's resurrected body, says that the difference between the pre- and post-resurrection body is analogous to the difference between different kinds of animal flesh. It is just an analogy. You know, like fish and dogs both have flesh, but they're not of the same kind. They're both flesh, but they're not of the same kind. He says it's like that with the resurrection body. It's a body, but it's not entirely like the one you've got now.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much for your call, Peter. Hope that's helpful for you. Fast-moving hour today. Dr. David Anders, could you please tell us a little bit about calltocommunion.com?
Oh, yeah, thanks. Appreciate it. So it's a website that was started to dialogue between Reformed Protestants and Catholics, look at those areas of commonality and difference, and it was started by a bunch of people who were themselves formerly Reformed Presbyterians who've all become Catholics. I'm one of several contributors to that site, and I'm prejudiced, but I just think it's a great resource to inform yourself on Protestant Catholic differences, and look, we favor the Catholic side. Okay. Just truth in advertising here.
No great surprise there. Dr. David Anders, thank you so much.
Hey, thanks, Tom.
Hope everybody has a great weekend. We were looking forward to seeing you on Monday's edition of Call to Communion, For Dr. David Anders, I'm Tom Price. We will see you then. Have a great one. God bless.